My friend, before you close your eyes, the weight of the day may be heavy, but you do not have to carry it into the darkness. For there is a light that never dims and a love that never fails. You are safe in this stillness, protected by the one who counts every star and knows every hair on your head. Before you drift away, speak to him with the honesty of a tired traveler finding home. Tell him of your joys and your hidden pains, for he is the healer of hearts and the giver of true rest. Place your life in his gentle hands and trust in his constant watch. Surrender your will to his grace and let yourself fall into a deep, restorative sleep. You are guarded by his power and wrapped in his eternal peace. Have a serene and blessed night in the presence of the Lord. Lord, I come before you as the embers of this day fade and the world settles into a hush. I am not here to perform or to speak empty phrases, but to lay my soul bare before the only one who truly sees me. You, who hear the unspoken cry and understand the rhythm of my heart. I do not come seeking miracles for the eyes, but a miracle for the spirit, that I may feel your closeness in the fabric of this night. O gentle shepherd, as the moon takes its place, I realize that my soul thirsts for you more than a desert thirsts for rain. I want to shed the armor I wore today, the doubts that clouded my vision, and the desperate need to be in control. Teach me to trust the current of your love, and how to find stillness, not because my life is perfect, but because you are the anchor in every storm. And you are the one who transforms our weary ends into glorious new dawns. I feel today that the world demands a perfection I do not possess. It asks me to be unbreakable, to be certain, and to walk as if I am the master of my own fate. But tonight, with the humility of a branch that knows it cannot survive without the vine, I drop my guard. Lord, I am exhausted. This fatigue is not a failure, but a reminder that I am a creature and you are the creator. Wrap me in your quietude. Make my spirit like a sheltered garden, untouched by the frost of worry, and make my heart like a steady flame, unbothered by the winds of tomorrow. I pray for safety, not just from outward harm, but from the shadows of my own mind. How often have I wept over shadows that never became substance? And how often have I trembled at a future that rests safely in your palm? Lord, protect my thoughts from the maze of anxiety, and keep my spirit from drowning in the what-ifs of life. Help me believe that you are the watchful parent, whose heart never turns away, and whose path is always paved with mercy. Even when I walk in the dark, be the lamp that guides me home to your rest. You, fountain of tranquility, teach me how to rest as a bird rests in its nest, knowing it does not fall because you sustain it. Let this night be a sanctuary of healing. Repair the cracks in my hope, and strengthen the foundation of my faith. I do not ask for an easy life. I ask for a quiet soul, a peace that settles into my very bones, driving out every shadow and planting the seed of certainty that I am wanted, that I am seen, and that you are holding me, even when I am lost in the silence of sleep. I give thanks for every breath of this day, for the lessons that stung and the moments that sang, for all of it has brought me back to you. I let go of every hurt others caused, and I release the guilt I have held against myself, for I have surrendered it all to your grace. Open my eyes to recognize your beauty in the small things. Let me rise tomorrow with a refreshed heart, a grateful mind, and spirit ready to share your love with the world. Thank you for being my refuge. Thank you for being the voice that whispers peace when the world screams, "Hurry." I trust in your plan. I rest in your arms. And I commit my entire being to you in this holy sleep. Bless this house, and let your serenity fill every corner of my life. Amen. If this prayer touched your heart, please leave an amen in the comments to join our circle of peace. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that they are not alone tonight. Sleep well, and may you wake up renewed.